They banned me from digging a pond on my 150-year-old family ranch. The HOA next door decided I couldn't build anything on my own property. They fined me, threatened me with lawsuits, tried to crush me with their rules and regulations. But here's what they didn't know about messing with an old man who's lived on the same land for decades. Sometimes the oldest properties control more than you think. And when you push someone with nothing left to lose, they might just find a way to turn the lights out on your entire neighborhood. You're watching the wildest power move story on BD Stories. What country are you tuning in from? Let me start from the beginning. Margaret and I were married for 42 years. She was the only person who understood why I loved old electrical maps, why I knew the exact location of every power line in this area. She'd sit with me on the porch, watching me trace routes on decades-old blueprints spread across our kitchen table like treasure maps. "You're like a detective," she'd say, running her fingers along the faded lines, but for electricity. She made my obsession feel like a gift instead of a quirk. Every evening after dinner, she'd bring me coffee and sit beside me while I studied those maps, explaining how power flowed through our small town like blood through veins. 6 months ago, in that sterile hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying dreams, Margaret gripped my hand with what little strength she had left. The machines beeped rhythmically around us, marking time we didn't have. "Promise me a small pond in the corner of the garden," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. "A place where I can sit and watch the sunset forever." Those were her last words to me. Not "I love you" or "take care of yourself," just a pond. A simple request that would become my battlefield, though I didn't know it then. I began with the first stake 3 weeks after her funeral, when the flowers had wilted and the casseroles had been eaten. Each wooden marker had sacred meaning. Where Margaret would sit, the corner for evening lighting, the spot for the stone bench I'd carve myself. I measured every inch like it was made of diamonds, because to me, it was. The morning dew soaked through my work boots as I paced the area, visualizing how the water would catch the light, how the small waterfall would sound in the evening quiet. This wasn't just construction. It was a cathedral I was building for the woman who'd made my life whole. While digging the first shovelful of earth, I looked up at the power lines running through my yard, like giant spiderwebs against the sky. Margaret once said during one of our evening talks, "Strange how that electrical pole is older than our house." I'd never paid attention to that detail before, too focused on the technical aspects of voltage and capacity. Now, with dirt under my fingernails and sweat on my forehead, I wondered why a power company would put its main transmission line through private property. The thick cables hummed softly overhead, carrying electricity to hundreds of homes, including the fancy neighborhood that bordered my land. That's when Victoria Sterling appeared like a storm cloud on a clear day. Her white golf cart gleamed in the afternoon sun, matching her designer clothes and perfect makeup. She had that practiced smile that rich people wear when they're about to ruin your day. Sweet as honey, but cold as winter ice. "Mr. Morrison," she said, stepping carefully around the freshly turned earth in her spotless white shoes, "I understand your grief, but Blackwood Heights has landscape standards to protect everyone's property values." She handed me a glossy pamphlet titled Community Aesthetic Guidelines, its pages filled with pictures of perfectly manicured lawns and approved garden features. I thought it was neighborly advice, maybe even sympathy for a widower trying to honor his wife's memory. I didn't know she was declaring war on a grieving man who just wanted to keep a promise. Victoria's eyes swept over my modest property with barely concealed disdain, taking in the weathered barn, the old farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of my family, the vegetable garden Margaret had tended with such care. "Of course, we all want to maintain the rural charm of the area," she continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "but we must consider how individual projects might affect the overall aesthetic of our community." She spoke as if my 40-acre farm was somehow part of her precious homeowners association, as if she had any say in what I did with land my great-grandfather had purchased in 1873. But what Victoria didn't know was that I'd spent 40 years as an electrician, and I'd just noticed something about those power lines that could change everything. The question was, would I have the courage to use what I'd discovered? Have you ever had a neighbor who pushed you too far? Type pushed if you know exactly how I felt. 72 hours later, I received a legal letter that made my blood run cold and my hands shake with rage. It wasn't just a polite request from a concerned neighbor. It was a full-scale legal assault delivered by certified mail. The letterhead belonged to Sterling and Associates, a law firm that specialized in property disputes, and the language was as sharp as a knife. Not only was I banned from digging the pond, but I was being demanded to pay $5,000 for an environmental study from EcoConsult Solutions, a company that, according to the fine print, was owned by Victoria's husband. It wasn't a request, it was legalized extortion, disguised as environmental protection, a shakedown wrapped in legal jargon and stamped with official seals. While reading the letter at my kitchen table, trying to process the audacity of what I was seeing, I noticed my electric bill lying nearby. It was just monthly paperwork I usually paid without much thought, but something caught my eye this time. A small line at the bottom read, "Service via Morrison Property Access." I stared at that phrase, wondering why they needed to go through my land to provide service to other homes. Why would the power company route its lines through private property when it could run them along public roads? But I was too angry to think clearly about what that might mean, too focused on the injustice of being threatened with legal action for trying to honor my wife's dying wish. I looked at Margaret's photo sitting on the kitchen table in its simple wooden frame, the one I'd made in my workshop years ago. She was smiling in her favorite chair, the one that now sat empty in our living room like a monument to loss. The afternoon light streaming through the window seemed to illuminate her face, making her look almost alive. "What would you do, Maggie?" I asked the silence, my voice cracking with emotion I'd been holding back for months. I could almost hear her voice, warm and steady like it had been for 4 decades. "Fight for what's right, Harold, but fight smart." She always knew when to stand up and when to step back, when to use force and when to use finesse. Later that evening, I learned the truth about Victoria's hatred from my neighbor, an elderly woman who'd lived in the area for decades, and witnessed the slow buildup of resentment that had finally exploded into this confrontation. She sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, her voice low and careful as she revealed what everyone in the community had known but never dared to speak aloud. Victoria Sterling had always resented Margaret with the burning intensity of someone who'd never been able to accept second place. At the monthly garden club meetings, Margaret's roses consistently won first place, their blooms more vibrant and their fragrance more intoxicating than anything Victoria could coax from her perfectly manicured beds. Margaret's dinner parties were legendary in our small community, drawing people from miles around to enjoy her cooking and conversation, while Victoria's more elaborate gatherings always felt forced and artificial. "Margaret Morrison thinks she's better than everyone," Victoria would whisper to anyone who would listen, her voice dripping with jealousy and spite that had fermented for years. She'd stand in the corner of garden club meetings, watching Margaret accept yet another first-place ribbon, her face twisted with an envy that bordered on pathological. Even Margaret's quiet grace in accepting these honors seemed to infuriate Victoria more, as if my wife's humility was somehow a calculated insult to her own desperate need for recognition. The rivalry had poisoned Victoria's heart for decades, turning what should have been friendly community competition into a personal vendetta that survived even Margaret's death. In Victoria's twisted mind, even a dead woman was still a threat to her status as the neighborhood's undisputed queen. Victoria organized an emergency HOA meeting for the following Thursday, sending out notices that made it sound like a community crisis was brewing. The meeting was held in the sterile conference room of the local bank, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. I brought Margaret's photo with me, placed it gently on the table like a talisman, and talked about our 42 years together. I spoke about the promise that kept me breathing, the simple request that had become my reason for getting out of bed each morning. A few people seemed genuinely moved by my story, their eyes softening as I described Margaret's final words and the sacred nature of the pond I wanted to build. But Victoria was prepared for this emotional appeal, had orchestrated the entire evening like a theatrical performance designed to destroy my credibility and justify her action. She had photographs of me digging, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, as if I were some kind of criminal. The images showed me working alone in the early morning light, my old body bent over a shovel, dirt flying as I broke ground on what should have been a labor of love. "Mr. Morrison violated our community regulations before seeking proper permission," she announced to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "This sets a dangerous precedent for other property owners who might decide to ignore our established guidelines." Her performance was masterful, combining legal authority with moral outrage, painting me as a reckless old man who threatened the very foundation of civilized society. The vote was swift and brutal, 11-0 against me, with even people who'd seemed sympathetic earlier raising their hands to condemn my project. Then Victoria delivered the knockout punch that would haunt me for days to come. Due to clear violations of our community standards, she announced with barely concealed satisfaction, we're implementing a $1,000 immediate fine to deter future infractions. The words hit me like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of dignity I'd spent a lifetime building. I held the official notice in my shaking hands, the numbers blurring through tears of rage and humiliation. Walking to my truck after the meeting, I heard whispers following me like shadows. Stubborn old man. He should know better at his age. Some people just can't accept community standards. For the first time in my life, I felt publicly destroyed, stripped of dignity in front of people I'd known for decades, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale about what happens when you challenge authority. That night, sitting alone in my dark kitchen with only Margaret's photo for company, I made a decision that would change everything. The legal letter lay spread on the table before me like a declaration of war, and I realized I needed to arm myself with more than just righteous anger. I had to dig into family papers that hadn't been touched in decades. Documents that Margaret had carefully preserved in an old wooden box in our bedroom closet. What I found in those yellowed pages would either save me or destroy me completely. But I was past caring about the consequences. Victoria Sterling had made the mistake of picking a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Ever been humiliated in public? Type humiliated if you felt that punch to the gut. The next morning, I decided to research my property rights with the determination of a man who'd been backed into a corner. If I couldn't dig the pond, at least I wanted to understand why a homeowners association that didn't even govern my property could dictate what I did with land my family had owned for generations. The county archives building was a dusty repository of forgotten history, smelling like old paper and lost dreams. I was looking for property boundaries and easement records, anything that might give me legal standing to fight Victoria's tyranny. But I was about to find something much more powerful than I'd ever imagined. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with thick glasses and ink-stained fingers, helped me locate the original survey maps from the 1800s. She pulled out a large, leather-bound book filled with hand-drawn property lines and surveyor's notes written in faded ink. "These are the original township records," she explained, handling the brittle pages with reverence. "Everything from when this area was first settled and divided." As I turned through the pages tracing the evolution of my family's land through decades of changes, I found the original 1890 map that showed my property in remarkable detail. A red line ran diagonally across the northern section with a notation that made my heart skip: "Electrical right-of-way granted to municipal power company." I took a photograph of the page with my phone, thinking it might be useful later. Little did I know I was photographing my weapon of mass destruction. Back at home, I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for 4 decades, each step creaking under my weight like a countdown to revelation. In the closet, behind her dresses that still smelled faintly of her perfume, sat the wooden box of family documents she'd carefully preserved. Margaret had always been the keeper of our family history, organizing and protecting papers that most people would have thrown away. "These old documents are important, Harold," she'd told me countless times. "You never know when you might need to prove something." Inside the box were papers spanning 4 generations, deeds, contracts, letters, and legal documents that told the story of my family's life on this land. And then I found it, buried beneath a stack of old tax records and wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time. A yellowed contract dated October 15, 1890, written in the formal language of a bygone era. The document was titled Electrical Transmission Easement Agreement, and it was signed by my great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, and the municipal power company of our county. As I read through the legal language, my hands began to tremble with excitement and disbelief. The contract wasn't just permission for power lines to cross my property, it was a detailed agreement that gave my family specific rights in exchange for that access. The key clause, written in faded but still legible ink, changed everything. The grantor reserves the right to request temporary cessation of electrical transmission for safety purposes during construction, agricultural, or maintenance activities on the property, with 48 hours written notice to the power company. It was like finding a secret passage in a house I'd lived in my entire life. The power lines running through my property weren't just crossing my land, they were borrowing it under terms that gave me incredible leverage. When I needed to build something safely, the power company was legally obligated to shut off the electricity temporarily. It was that simple, and that devastating. I sat in my living room, holding a piece of paper that could cut power to 200 homes with a single phone call. The irony was perfect. Victoria had picked a fight with the one person in the entire area who had the legal authority to plunge her precious neighborhood into darkness. She'd made one critical mistake. She'd declared war on someone who understood electricity better than she understood power politics. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I smiled. Not with malice or thoughts of revenge, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd just discovered he wasn't as helpless as everyone thought. This wasn't about getting even, it was about justice, about standing up to a bully who'd pushed too far. I spent the rest of the day reading and rereading the contract, making sure I understood every clause and implication. The language was clear and unambiguous. I had the right to request a temporary power shutdown for construction activities. Building a pond definitely qualified as construction. The power company was required to comply with reasonable requests, and 48 hours was more than a reasonable notice. I called my lawyer, a steady man who'd handled my family's legal affairs for 20 years, and asked him to review the document. His voice was filled with amazement when he called back an hour later. "Harold, this is ironclad. I've never seen anything like it, but it's completely legal and binding." That evening, I sat on my porch as the sun set behind the hills, watching the power lines carry electricity to homes throughout the valley. The cables hummed softly in the breeze, a sound I'd heard every day of my life, but never really appreciated until now. Those lines represented more than just electrical current. They were the lifeline of Victoria's entire neighborhood, the invisible thread that connected her world to comfort and convenience. And I held the power to cut that thread whenever I deemed it necessary for my construction project. The pond I wanted to build for Margaret had become something larger, a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a declaration that some things are more sacred than property values and community standards. I had the weapon. Now I had to decide, would I actually use it? And if I did, would I become the monster Victoria claimed I was, or would I finally get the justice Margaret deserved? Would you have used this power? Type "use it" if you'd go nuclear, or "hold back" if you'd hesitate. Monday morning arrived with the clarity that comes from a sleepless night of decision-making. I hired my lawyer to draft a letter to the municipal power company, each word carefully chosen to be both legal and devastating. Request to temporarily shut off electrical power to the Blackwood Heights subdivision for 48 hours, beginning Friday at 2 p.m., to ensure safety while I conduct construction activities on my property in accordance with the October 15, 1890 Electrical Transmission Easement Agreement. My lawyer's hands actually shook as he typed the letter, pausing several times to look at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Harold," he said, "I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" Tuesday morning, the power company called back with the nervous energy of an organization that had just discovered a legal landmine in their backyard. The customer service representative had been replaced by a senior manager who spoke in measured tones, trying to maintain professional courtesy while dealing with an unprecedented situation. "Mr. Morrison, we've reviewed your documentation with our legal team. We're obligated to comply with your request under the terms of the original easement agreement. However, we want to confirm that you understand the scope of this action. This will affect approximately 200 homes, including residents with medical equipment, home offices, and families with young children." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd been tasked with talking me out of something that was perfectly legal but potentially catastrophic. I answered with the calm certainty of a man who'd made his peace with necessary action. "I understand completely. The construction of my pond requires a temporary power shutdown for safety reasons. Friday at 2 p.m. as specified in my notice." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the sound of someone realizing they were dealing with a force they couldn't control or negotiate with. The manager's voice had changed when he spoke again, taking on the resigned tone of someone who'd run out of options. "Very well, Mr. Morrison. We'll begin the shutdown procedure at exactly 2 p.m. on Friday. The power will be restored once you've completed your safety inspection and given us clearance to resume service." Wednesday evening brought a revelation that confirmed everything I'd suspected about Victoria's true motivations. I was working in my garden when I heard her voice carrying across the evening air, loud and agitated as she spoke to someone on her phone. She was pacing in her driveway, apparently unaware that her words were traveling clearly in the still air. That old man thinks he can embarrass me like his wife embarrassed me at the garden club for 20 years, she said, her voice filled with venom that had been building for decades. Maggie Morrison always acted like she was better than everyone, with her perfect roses and her perfect marriage and her perfect little life. Well, now I'll show her husband what real power looks like. He'll regret the day he decided to mess with me. The words hit me like a physical blow, confirming what I'd suspected but never wanted to believe. This wasn't about community standards or property values or environmental concerns. This was about a woman who'd nursed a grudge against my dead wife for 20 years, who'd let jealousy and resentment poison her heart until she couldn't distinguish between justice and revenge. Victoria Sterling had turned my grief into her opportunity for payback, had used my wife's dying wish as a weapon against me simply because she couldn't stand the thought that Margaret Morrison might be remembered fondly while she was merely tolerated. The revelation filled me with a cold fury that burned steadier and hotter than any rage I'd ever experienced. Standing there in my garden, listening to Victoria's poisonous words about my dead wife, I felt something shift inside me that I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about a pond anymore. It was about defending Margaret's memory against someone who'd spent decades trying to destroy it. Victoria had revealed her true nature, shown me that all her talk about community standards and property values was just a thin veneer covering 20 years of festering jealousy. She'd turned my grief into her opportunity, my wife's dying wish into her weapon of revenge. At that moment, I stopped feeling guilty about what I was about to do to her neighborhood. Victoria Sterling had declared war on a dead woman, and I was going to finish the fight Margaret never knew she was fighting. By Wednesday afternoon, word had spread through Blackwood Heights like wildfire, carried by phone calls, text messages, and frantic conversations at the local coffee shop. Every house in the neighborhood suddenly sprouted portable generators like mechanical flowers, their owners scrambling to protect refrigerated food, medical equipment, and the basic comforts of modern life. I watched from my kitchen window as panic buying commenced in earnest. Extension cords, flashlights, batteries, and anything else that might help them survive a temporary return to the pre-electrical age. The irony wasn't lost on me. These people who'd tried to control my life were now desperately trying to control the consequences of their own leaders' actions. Wednesday night brought a phone call that stripped away any remaining pretense of civility between Victoria and me. Her voice was shaking with rage and desperation, the careful composure she'd maintained during our previous encounters finally cracking under the pressure of impending defeat. "Mr. Morrison, you can't do this. People have medical equipment that depends on electricity. Food will spoil. Children will be traumatized. This is terrorism." She was shouting by the end, her words tumbling over each other in a waterfall of fury and fear. I replied with the same measured calm I'd used with the power company. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm simply exercising my legal rights under a contract that's been in effect for over a century. I'm conducting construction activities on my property, just as you conducted legal activities against me." Thursday evening brought the final piece of Victoria's desperate strategy into focus. I saw her pacing in her driveway again, cell phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing wildly as she spoke. Her voice carried across the evening air, filled with the urgent energy of someone orchestrating a last-ditch effort to save face. "Lisa, I need you to do a story about an elderly man terrorizing an entire neighborhood. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. when the power goes out. Make him look like a monster who's holding families hostage over a personal grudge. I want him destroyed on camera, completely humiliated in front of the entire community." She was preparing for war, marshaling the media to turn public opinion against me. But she'd already lost the battle. She just didn't know it yet. That night, I sat in my kitchen with Margaret's photo, the easement agreement spread on the table like a battle plan. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the power lines that would soon fall silent at my command. I thought about the 42 years Margaret and I had shared, the quiet strength she'd always shown in the face of adversity, the way she'd taught me that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is calm, calculated action. She would have understood what I was doing and why it was necessary. She would have supported my decision to stand up to a bully, even if it meant becoming temporarily unpopular with people who'd never really mattered anyway. Are you Team Hal or Team Victoria? Type Team Hal if you're rooting for the underdog. Friday afternoon arrived with the inevitability of a storm that had been building for weeks. At exactly 2 p.m., the municipal power company truck pulled into my driveway like a hearse arriving for a funeral, its diesel engine rumbling with mechanical authority. The driver, a weathered man in his 50s wearing a hard hat and utility belt, stepped out and nodded at me with the professional respect of one tradesman acknowledging another. Behind him came the parade of spectators that Victoria had assembled for my public humiliation. Victoria herself, resplendent in a pristine white suit that made her look like she was attending a charity gala rather than a neighbor's destruction. Lisa Park, the local journalist with her camera crew and that hungry look reporters get when they smell a story that might go viral, and approximately 30 residents of Blackwood Heights, clustering together like sheep seeking safety in numbers. The scene felt surreal, like a public execution from a bygone era, where crowds gathered to witness justice or injustice being served. Victoria had positioned herself perfectly for the cameras, standing where the afternoon light would illuminate her face in the most flattering way possible. She'd clearly rehearsed her performance, practicing the expressions of outrage and victimization that would play well on the evening news. "Today you'll witness a man seeking revenge against an entire community," she announced to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent years dominating homeowners association meetings. "This is what happens when individual selfishness destroys community harmony. This elderly man is holding 200 families hostage because we dared to enforce reasonable standards." Lisa Park approached me with her microphone extended like a weapon, her camera operator positioning himself to capture what they clearly expected to be my moment of defeat. Her questions came rapid fire, designed to back me into a corner where I'd look defensive and unreasonable. "Mr. Morrison, don't you think cutting power to an entire neighborhood is excessive? There are elderly people here, children and families with medical equipment that depends on electricity. How do you justify putting all these innocent people through this trauma just because you couldn't get permission for your pond?" The crowd murmured their agreement, a low rumble of disapproval that made it clear they'd already decided I was the villain in this story. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of their judgment settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. Victoria's smile widened with each second of my silence, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was at hand. Lisa leaned closer with her microphone, sensing blood in the water, while her camera operator zoomed in on my face to capture what they assumed would be my surrender. The residents of Blackwood Heights watched with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a car accident, simultaneously horrified and unable to look away. This was exactly what Victoria had orchestrated. A public spectacle where I would be forced to back down or be forever branded as the crazy old man who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood. But I wasn't the same broken widower who'd been humiliated at the HOA meeting weeks earlier. I'd spent sleepless nights researching law, consulting with my attorney, and preparing for this exact moment. The silence stretched like a held breath, building tension that made even the camera operator shift nervously behind his equipment. Victoria's confidence was so complete that she actually took a step forward, preparing to deliver what she thought would be the final blow to my reputation. The crowd began to whisper among themselves, interpreting my pause as hesitation, as the moment when the old man would finally realize he'd gone too far and beg for forgiveness. Instead, I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper that would change everything. The document was photocopied on legal-size paper with official letterhead and signatures that couldn't be disputed or dismissed. As I unfolded it slowly, deliberately, I watched Victoria's expression begin to shift from triumph to uncertainty. She couldn't see what I was holding, but something in my demeanor had changed, and her finely tuned instincts for power dynamics were beginning to sound warning bells. The crowd's murmur died to complete silence, that eerie quiet that comes when people sense they're about to witness something significant. "Miss Park," I said, my voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the authority of someone who just remembered he held all the cards. "I'm not seeking revenge against anyone. I'm simply exercising rights that were granted to my family on October 15, 1890, more than 130 years ago." I held up the easement agreement, its aged paper catching the afternoon light like a banner of vindication. "These power lines don't just cross my property. They exist here at my family's sufferance, under a contract that gives me specific rights in exchange for that access. When I need to conduct construction activities on my land, the power company is legally obligated to temporarily shut off electricity to ensure safety." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Victoria's face went pale as she realized that her carefully orchestrated public humiliation was about to backfire spectacularly. Lisa Park's expression shifted from predatory anticipation to genuine journalistic interest. This wasn't the story she'd expected to cover, but it was potentially much more interesting. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time the sound was confusion rather than condemnation. They'd come to witness the downfall of a stubborn old man, but instead they were seeing the revelation of a legal reality none of them had imagined possible. Then I looked directly into the camera and delivered the line that would haunt Victoria for the rest of her life. This isn't about revenge, it's about respect. Respect for the law, respect for property rights, and respect for a dying woman's simple request to have a pond where she could watch the sunset. Can you feel the tension? Type "reveal it" if you're ready for the truth bomb. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the power went out with the finality of a judge's gavel. The entire Blackwood Heights neighborhood fell silent in a way that only happens when the constant hum of modern life suddenly stops. Air conditioners ceased their mechanical breathing, televisions died mid-sentence, and the subtle electronic buzz that most people never notice simply vanished. Only my house remained lit, powered by the generator I'd installed the previous week, standing like a lighthouse in a sea of darkness I had created with nothing more than a phone call and a contract older than anyone alive. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I'd become the only source of light in a darkness that was both literal and metaphorical. Victoria's carefully constructed composure cracked like thin ice under sudden pressure. In the unnatural silence that followed the power shutdown, her voice rose to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "This isn't legal. This entire neighborhood was built to code. I checked everything personally. I've been the HOA president for 8 years. I know every regulation, every ordinance, every rule that governs this community." Her words tumbled over each other in a waterfall of desperation and denial, each sentence growing more frantic as she realized that her authority meant nothing in the face of a contract that predated her existence by several decades. The perfect facade she'd maintained for years was crumbling on camera, revealing the petty tyrant beneath the polished exterior. Lisa Park's journalistic instincts kicked in as she recognized that the story was taking an unexpected turn. This wasn't just about a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was about the collision between modern suburban entitlement and historical legal rights, between the assumed authority of homeowners associations and the bedrock principles of property law. Her camera operator continued filming as Victoria's meltdown intensified, capturing every moment of what was becoming a spectacular public downfall. "Mrs. Sterling," Lisa said, her voice carrying the professional calm of someone who'd learned to ask hard questions, "can you explain how you have the authority to prevent Mr. Morrison from building on his own property, especially given that he's not a member of your homeowners association?" Just then, as if summoned by the chaos itself, Michael Torres appeared at the edge of the crowd like a deus ex machina in a county inspector's uniform. Victoria had called him the previous day, requesting that he document violations on my property, confident that official scrutiny would provide the final nail in my coffin. The irony was perfect. She'd brought the very person who would expose her own crimes. Michael was a thorough man who took his job seriously, carrying official township maps and surveying equipment that would make any property dispute academic rather than emotional. He'd come prepared to investigate building code violations, but he was about to uncover something much more significant. "Mrs. Sterling," Michael said, approaching with the measured pace of someone who dealt with property disputes for decades, "you mentioned on the phone that you wanted me to verify building compliance and property boundaries. I've brought the official township survey maps to ensure we get accurate measurements." He opened his folder and spread out the current zoning map, then pulled out a historical survey that made my heart race with recognition. It was the exact same map I'd photographed at the county archives weeks earlier, the one that showed the original property lines established when the area was first subdivided. I realized that fate was working in the most poetic way possible. The same document that had revealed my legal weapon was now about to expose Victoria's illegal activities. Michael worked methodically, using a laser measuring device to check the position of the Blackwood Heights entrance gate against the historical property boundaries. He compared his readings to both the current zoning map and the historical survey I'd accidentally photographed, cross-referencing coordinates and making careful notes. The crowd watched in fascination as he measured once, frowned, then measured again with the precision of someone who'd learned never to make accusations without absolute certainty. "This is interesting," he said, looking up from his instruments, with the expression of someone who'd just made a discovery that would change everything. "I'm getting the same readings as this historical survey from 1890, which means the original property lines are still legally binding." The connection wasn't lost on me. Michael was using the exact same historical survey map that I'd photographed during my research at the county archives. What had seemed like a fortunate accident at the time was now revealing itself as something more significant. The same document that had shown me the easement agreement was now exposing Victoria's violations. I couldn't help but marvel at the cosmic justice of the situation. The same trip to the county archives that had revealed my legal weapon was now providing the ammunition for Victoria's destruction. When I'd been accidentally given the wrong historical survey map, I'd thought it was just a clerical error. Now I realize it was destiny preparing me for this exact moment. The photograph I'd taken of that map, thinking it might be useful someday, had become the key to exposing years of illegal construction. Victoria had spent so much time trying to control others that she'd forgotten to ensure her own compliance with the law. The woman who'd demanded environmental impact studies and threatened legal action had been violating county zoning regulations for nearly a decade. As I watched Michael compare his measurements to the historical boundaries, I felt Margaret's presence beside me, as if she were witnessing the vindication of everything she'd stood for during her lifetime. The roses that had made Victoria so jealous, the grace that had made her so resentful, the quiet dignity that had driven her to such extremes, all of it was being honored in this moment of perfect justice. Fate works in mysterious ways, and this moment felt like the universe was finally balancing the scales of justice. I watched as Michael compared the measurements to the historical boundaries, seeing the same shock on his face that I'd felt when I first discovered the easement agreement in my family's papers. "Mrs. Sterling," Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "there's a serious problem here. According to these measurements and the historical survey records, your entrance gate and the first 200 feet of decorative wall have been built entirely on public right-of-ways property, not on your homeowners association land. This is a major violation of county zoning regulations that's been in effect for at least 8 years. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow, creating a moment of stunned silence that stretched until it became almost unbearable. Victoria's face went white as the implications sank in, her mind racing to process what this meant for her authority, her reputation, and her legal standing. The fine for this level of encroachment would be $50,000, Michael explained, and all structures built on public property would have to be removed immediately. Lisa Park's camera captured every moment of the collapse, from the initial shock to the growing horror, as Victoria realized that her years of dominating the neighborhood had been built on a foundation of illegal construction. The residents of Blackwood Heights began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising as they understood that their HOA president had been operating from a position of illegal authority while lecturing others about rule compliance. The woman who'd tried to fine me for digging on my own property had been violating county law for nearly a decade. "That's impossible," Victoria stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had surveys done, we followed all the regulations, we got permits." But Michael was already shaking his head, his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd seen this situation before. The numbers hit Victoria like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of her carefully constructed authority. Lisa Park, recognizing the story of a lifetime unfolding before her camera, pressed forward with the relentless pursuit of truth. "Mrs. Sterling, do you have any comment about the HOA violating building codes while simultaneously trying to prevent Mr. Morrison from legally building on his own property?" Victoria tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. The woman who'd spent years dominating homeowners association meetings had been reduced to silence by the revelation of her own violations. In that moment, watching her crumble before the cameras, I felt the quiet completion of justice finally served. "Did you see that coming?" type karma if you love when justice serves itself. The aftermath of Victoria's public downfall unfolded with the inexorable logic of consequences finally catching up with actions. Lisa Park's news report aired that evening, transforming what Victoria had intended to be my public humiliation into her own professional obituary. The story had everything viewers loved: a David versus Goliath narrative, legal documents that predated the Civil War, and the spectacular downfall of a petty tyrant who'd finally pushed the wrong person too far. Within hours, the footage of Victoria's meltdown was spreading across social media, shared by people who'd had their own encounters with overzealous homeowners associations and power-hungry neighborhood officials. The woman who'd tried to control my life had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. Power was restored to Blackwood Heights after 6 hours, but Victoria's reign ended that very night. She submitted her resignation as HOA president in a terse email that blamed personal attacks and media distortion for her decision to step down. Within 2 weeks, she'd put her house on the market and moved to a different state, unable to face the daily reminder of her humiliation. The ornate entrance gate that had been the symbol of her authority was demolished within a month, replaced by a simple road sign that marked the boundary between public and private property. The $50,000 fine was paid by the Homeowners Association, effectively doubling everyone's annual dues and serving as a permanent reminder of the cost of electing leaders who prioritize control over competence. Many residents came to my door in the days following the confrontation, bringing casseroles, flowers, and genuine remorse for their role in the harassment I'd endured. These were decent people who'd been misled by someone they'd trusted to represent their interests, and their apologies carried the weight of real regret. "We didn't know what really happened," they said, standing on my porch with downcast eyes and voices filled with shame. "We thought you were just being difficult." I accepted their apologies with the same grace Margaret would have shown, understanding that they'd been victims of Victoria's manipulation just as much as I had been. Victoria was trying to protect what she thought was right, I told them. We all make mistakes when we're scared of change. The construction of Margaret's pond resumed the following Monday, this time without interference from anyone. No permits were required, no fines were threatened, and no legal letters arrived in my mailbox. Just the simple freedom to keep a promise to the woman who'd made my life whole for 42 years. As I worked, I found myself talking to Margaret as if she were sitting on her favorite chair, watching me measure and dig and plan the waterfall that would sing her to sleep every evening. "You'd love this spot, honey," I said, pausing to wipe sweat from my forehead. "The sunset hits the water just right and the sound will carry all the way to the kitchen window." The work progressed steadily through the summer, each day bringing the vision closer to reality. I hired a local mason to help with the stone walls, a gentle man who understood that this wasn't just landscaping, but a sacred project that required reverence and care. We worked mostly in silence, the only sounds the scrape of tools against stone and the distant hum of power lines that had become symbols of justice rather than oppression. Neighbors stopped by occasionally to check on the progress, some offering help or advice, others simply wanting to witness the completion of something that had become larger than a simple garden feature. In late August, while cleaning out Margaret's closet to make room for pond supplies, I found a letter she'd written but never sent, tucked between the pages of her favorite cookbook like a pressed flower. The envelope was addressed to me in her careful handwriting, sealed with the kind of attention to detail that had characterized everything she'd done in life. Inside, written on her personal stationery with the fountain pen I'd given her for our 20th anniversary, were words that seemed to have been written specifically for this moment. "Harold, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling lost. Don't let yourself become a silent person after I'm gone. Do something beautiful. Something that proves love conquers all, even death. I know you'll find a way to keep your promise, because you've never broken a promise to me in all our years together." The pond was completed in early September, just as the leaves began to turn, and the evening light took on that golden quality that comes with the changing seasons. The water was crystal clear, fed by a small recirculating pump that created the gentle sound of flowing water Margaret had always loved. The stone bench was positioned perfectly to catch the sunset, surrounded by the flowers she'd planted years earlier and tended with such care. As I sat there for the first time, watching the light dance on the water's surface, I felt her presence so strongly it was almost physical. The empty space beside me on the bench wasn't empty at all. It was filled with 42 years of shared memories, quiet conversations, and the kind of love that transcends death. The legal battle had ended, the neighborhood had returned to its normal rhythm, and Victoria's tyranny had become nothing more than a cautionary tale that people would tell for years to come. But the real victory wasn't in defeating an enemy or proving a point. It was in completing something beautiful, something that honored the woman who'd made my life worth living. Every evening, I sit by the pond with my coffee and watch the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The sound of the small waterfall mingles with the distant hum of power lines, creating a symphony that speaks of justice served and promises kept. The pond is finished, Victoria is gone, and justice was served in the most poetic way possible. But the real question isn't about homeowners associations or legal contracts or the rights of property owners. The real question is, what would you do if someone tried to stop you from honoring the person you loved most? What promises have you made that you'd fight to keep, regardless of the obstacles in your way? What would you sacrifice to prove that love conquers all, even the petty tyranny of people who mistake authority for righteousness? Share your story in the comments. Type "promise kept" if this reminded you of someone you love. Final word. Exactly. Contaminated words, exactly.
Still here? You're one of us now. Subscribe to BD Stories and binge like your group chat depends on it.